Intel have just announced their next-generation desktop gaming GPUs, codenamed battlemage, starting with the B580 and B570, two budget-friendly GPUs that finally bring good value to the sub-$300 segment. With this launch, many PC gamers were left wondering if these new budget GPUs are this good, could Intel really shake up the market with the inevitable B770 and possibly even a B780? At what level will those perform at? Well, let's see what we can find out. Before becoming a full-time content creator, I worked as an information architect, where coding was a daily challenge. If only boot.dev existed back then, it would have made my life so much easier. Boot.dev is revolutionizing programming education through gamification. Imagine learning Python and Go not as a tedious task, but as an immersive online RPG, where you complete daily coding quests, gain skills like experience points, and where your progress feels like leveling up in a game. What I find genius about boot.dev is that it keeps you engaged while writing real code. With an AI assistant named Boots ready to help when you're stuck, and an active Discord community for support, learning becomes enjoyable and rewarding. According to Stack Overflow, backend developers earn a median salary over $100,000 per year, with many roles offering remote work flexibility. Boot.dev is your pathway to unlocking these opportunities. Want to test the waters? There's a free demo for each course. And here's the best part: use my code Cortex to get 25% off your first month, or even your entire first year if you choose the annual plan. Invest in yourself by clicking the link in the description and start your programming quest with boot.dev. The G21 die, which is used in the B580 and B570, features 5 slices with what looks like a very optimized architecture for optimal occupancy. One thing that immediately stands out to me is the cache, with the L2 being shared among all slices for a total of only 18 megabytes. Each core then has its own L1 cache, of course, at 256 kbytes per core, which is double what you'd find in NVIDIA's Ada Lovelace GPUs, for instance. So there's less L2 but more L1 in broad terms, and that's an interesting point to keep in mind. Another interesting choice is that while the previous generation Alchemist featured more cores and lower clocks, which made it better at throughput but potentially worse at gaming workloads, now with battlemage we see a more focused design, with the B580 clocking up to 2670 MHz but only having 20 cores, where last gen's A750 for instance had 28 cores but only clocked up to 2050 MHz. The GPU of course has fixed function for workloads that would potentially suffer from the lower throughput, like the ray tracing unit, and also fixed function for video encoding with a dual pipeline, and there's fixed function for the AI upscaling tech. These decisions do come at a cost, and the die is pretty big for a mid-range GPU at 272mm squared, especially considering this is supposedly on TSMC's N5 instead of N6 like the previous gen. That's a lot of silicon for a budget card, which makes me wonder if Intel might be selling these at a loss just to get some market share and broader developer support. That would make the B570 and B580 sort of Trojan horses into what is an almost impenetrable desktop GPU market. There's also faster GDDR6 at 19 gigabits per second used here compared to last gen, which helps mitigate the lower bandwidth somewhat, and these seem to be lower clocked 20 gigabit per second Samsung dies. Given that this GPU is designed for cards that target the 1440p resolution, the PCIe configuration is PCIe 4x8 instead of 16, which makes sense as you're not going to be saturating 8 lanes at 1440p. I would imagine that this will change for the B770 though, assuming that it will be targeting 4K, and we'll get to that in a second. Another interesting choice from Intel is limiting the memory interface to 192-bit on this die, which means they can offer 12GB of VRAM on the B580 and 10GB on the B570. For 1440p gaming, this is the sweet spot and lets Intel price these cards more aggressively than AMD and Nvidia would. If games like Stalker 2 are an indication of what to expect in 2025, 8GB of VRAM will no longer cut it for 1440p gaming. And with gamers upgrading monitors this holiday season, they will want a new GPU that can take advantage of the new resolution. And I don't mean the New Year's resolution, I mean the monitor's resolution. And with 12GB of VRAM at only $250, the B580 looks like a winner to me. This also falls in line with Battlemage's overall ethos of bringing ray tracing to the mainstream, as VRAM can become a bottleneck when ray tracing is enabled, depending on how a GPU is designed, of course. As for the B570, what jumps out to me as a great value proposition for this product is the media engine, with hardware acceleration for AV1, HEVC, and AVC with dual encoders, along with new XMX extensions and 10GB of VRAM. This will be a go-to card for content creators. In fact, at $220, this card might be worth it as a secondary card in your rig just for the media acceleration. I doubt that the B570 will be a good purchase for gaming alone. I think it's exclusively a creator's card first that also happens to play games decently. As an example, on Intel's performance disclaimers, Handbrake shows a 19% uplift compared to the A750 when doing 4K video conversions on these Battlemage cards. You also get HDMI 2.1 and DisplayPort 2.1, so these cards pair really well with OLED TVs at high refresh rates, making them great options for media center PCs for your living room, especially if you encode/decode your own media. If you use streaming services, you don't really need a discrete GPU anyway, but if you like to have control and ownership of your media, these GPUs are another win for that use case, given that price, especially as Intel claims that their reference design produces half the noise generated compared to their previous gen designs, with up to 50% better efficiency, so the cards should be whisper quiet. Now, looking at actual performance, at least going by Intel's own numbers, a few things stand out. On Intel's performance website, where they list the claimed performance of all of their products, there's a section where the B580 is compared to the A770, and at 1440p ultra settings, the B580 is 13% faster on average than last generation's flagship. If we use Tech PowerUp's GPU database, and yes, this will vary slightly depending on which reviewer you use as a baseline, we see that at 13% faster than the A770, we find the 2080 Super, which means the new Battlemage B580 is faster than AMD's 7600 XT and approaching the 3060 Ti. These results are, however, at 1080p, not 1440p, but they give us a good enough baseline comparison. And to add some validity to that, later on in that same webpage on Intel's website, the comparison between the B580 and the RTX 4060 puts it at 10% higher at 1440p. So again, that makes the B580 perform between the 3060 Ti and the 6700 XT, which at least on paper seems like excellent value at $250. Do note that Intel got these results using a 14900K CPU, but things get even more promising when you consider that these are the performance numbers at stock settings. But what if we can get even more performance? One user on Twitter called @Let'sBlameChina sent me a screenshot of a listing for the Gunir B580 OC model along with its specs, which in addition to being priced at roughly $280, shows a factory overclock of 2850 MHz, so about 200 MHz higher than the reference model. And Gunir is comparing it in this configuration to the 4060 Ti in their sales spiel. By the way, my personal philosophy is to never buy factory OC models and instead just buy the cheapest model available and overclock myself. And my recommendation is that you do the same. Back to the Gunir B580, it seems that if you overclock the GPU, you can get it close to the 4060 Ti, but of course instead of the meager 8GB of VRAM that Nvidia offers, you are getting 12GB. Assuming all models can overclock like this, that's icing on top of an already delicious delicious looking cake. Note that typically adding 200 MHz to the GPU clock doesn't just scale performance linearly, but the B580 is already optimized for occupancy and with higher L1 cache as we saw earlier, so the possible bottlenecks that would make a 200 MHz overclock useless have already been addressed with these design choices. So that gives me some hope that these extra 200 MHz will push the card closer to the 4060 Ti, which would be crazy at this price point. So going by Newegg prices, and I know that in other regions these prices are much higher, but we'll use the US prices as a reference point, the 4060 is currently going for $295, so roughly $50 more than the B580, and AMD 7600 XT, which should be on par or slower than the B580 reference model stock, is going for $320, so $70 more expensive. Both direct AMD and Nvidia alternatives to the stock version of the B580 are not only more expensive but also slower and with worse ray tracing performance. Again, I'm taking Intel's own testing numbers as being representative, but only independent reviews will confirm this. So on paper, battlemage seems awesome to me. The question is, for most PC enthusiasts, is all this enough to entice switching to Intel over one of the more established GPU makers? Based on what we know so far, I think this value proposition is just about enough to compensate for Intel's immature drivers, and there's hope that newly launched games should have day one drivers, considering that for Alchemist, Intel was always on top of games launches, in fact usually ahead of AMD for instance. There's no doubt that this is a very aggressive launch price considering what you are getting for the money, but unfortunately it's likely that Intel might fall into the same rut that AMD fell into, becoming another GPU company that only exists to keep Nvidia prices somewhat in check. It's a tough market, and Nvidia has such a tight grip on consumer mindshare that even at this price point, gamers might not be convinced to give Intel their money and instead spend more to get less performance from an Nvidia card, but have the peace of mind that they are getting a better supported card from the market leader. As AMD has shown numerous times in the past, it's not enough to undercut Nvidia and even offer better performance within a tier to take market share away from them. Just look at the 7900 XT performance numbers compared to the 4070 Ti Super and their price difference right now, and you get an idea of how difficult it is to take on Jensen's empire. The 7900 XT is around 3% faster on average, but you can bet the 4070 Ti Super is outselling it at 10 to 1, if not higher, while costing around $200 more. Can Intel succeed where AMD has failed? Well, one card that did well for AMD was the RX 580, which came to market under similar circumstances than the battlemage B580s coming in. Perhaps even the naming is not accidental, who knows. So I think there's a chance that the B580 succeeds because it's under the ceiling that most PC gamers have for spending money on a GPU, especially when you consider the whole world and not just the US, where there's more expendable income and lower barriers to access credit. Now, what can the B580 tell us about the B770 and possibly a B780, assuming that Intel will launch those in the first half of next year, which means in the next 6 months. The A770 die was 406mm squared, whereas the BGM G21 die used in the B580 and 70 is 272mm squared. So it stands to reason that if Intel made a 400mm die for their first gen, they will do the same for the second gen, or an even larger die than last time around. This is a completely different die though, with few similarities to Alchemist, so it's hard to say how Intel will grow the G21 die. I think one possibility is for Intel to make a 32-core B770, which would represent a 60% uplift in theoretical compute and result in a 435mm squared die roughly. While performance doesn't scale linearly with core count, we can guesstimate that such a GPU would perform around the level of a 6900 XT, so roughly 5 to 10% slower than a 4070 Super. Now, if Intel were to simply double the G21 die and make a 40-core GPU, then its performance would land around the 7900 XT or 4070 Ti Super. This is again looking at Tech PowerUp's relative performance chart, which I know has some caveats. If Intel builds, say, a B780 with with 40 cores, it would probably have to be priced at $550 at most, seeing as the 7900 XT is currently going for around $660. It's one thing to trust Intel with $250 to test the waters. It's another to go up to the $600 or $650 range, so the discount there versus the alternatives would have to be larger, so $550 seems appropriate. I don't think that Intel can go any higher than $550 at this point, and they might even have to come down to $500 for a loss leader just to have a chance to penetrate the market. The value proposition has to be phenomenal for PC gamers to spend that kind of money and accept some growing pains in terms of driver support. So will it be 32 cores or 40 cores? I think that 40 cores is the direction that Intel will be heading with the cards at the tier above the B580. So perhaps a B780 with 40 cores and a cut down B770 with the defective dies, probably even a B760 and 50, as it's going to be a pretty large die, so there will be plenty of defective dies to make into cut down versions. Considering that on Newegg the 4070 Ti Super is currently selling for around $800, a card on that level for $500 to $550 would be great value, no doubt about it. Maybe this is all hopium wishful thinking, but the B580 really set the bar high in terms of expectations, so I don't think it's unreasonable to expect to be positively surprised again by Intel in the coming months. What Intel accomplished with 2nd Gen Arc is already very impressive. The amount of human resources and money that went into getting to this point is staggering, and just goes to show how impenetrable the GPU market really is. And honestly, I don't think there's any other way for Intel to be approaching the market than this, to be undercutting the competition on price and delivering higher relative performance per tier, while offering similar features, which Intel seems to be doing with the newly announced XeSS 2. I don't think Nvidia will have to worry much about battlemage, but as far as AMD is concerned, those who lost faith in Radeon in recent times could now turn to Intel. If anything, Intel will be forcing AMD to significantly step up their game, or they will have their lunch eaten by Intel. And to that matter, Tom Peterson already confirmed that next-gen Celestion has been taped out, meaning by early 2026, Intel will want to be releasing Celestial, aiming for the ultra enthusiast tier. And given the progress we've seen from Alchemist to Battlemage, I think they can get there. This video was made possible by my awesome patrons. Become a patron today for just a couple of dollars per month and get exclusive access to the Cortex Discord server. If you can't support the channel financially at this time, then please give this video a like and share it, as that really helps. Thanks for watching, and until the next one.